Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. It is official, folks. Wizards of the Coast has announced that they are doing Homelands Remastered. That's right, it is going to come to Magic the Gathering Arena, but more than that, it is going to come standard legal. It's going to affect all formats of the game, and there are going to be new ways to play. All 115 cards from the original Homelands are being brought to the digital world. So, there are an enormous number of changes that we need to cover. With this new update to the game, it's an exciting time, and there's some cool new tech for some of the existing decks. Also, it's going to be a new limited format, a whole new experience to learn. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Today I'm going to do a rules primer on some of the primary mechanics of the set and things to make sure you don't trip up on. All right, first up we're going to talk about banding. So this is a new set mechanic that's going to come with Homelands to Arena. So banding is an ability that creatures have. It affects combat. So when a creature is attacking, any number of creatures with banding plus up to one creature without banding can form an attacking band. That means they all attack as a single unit, right? You can choose to block all of the creatures of that banded unit with one creature. But if you have special damage abilities, right, with creatures in that attacking band like First Strike, you get to apply how all of that damage occurs to the blocking creatures and in the order that you want. This is especially useful with trample. If you have a giant trampling creature in your attacking band, you can have all of your non-trampling creatures assign the lethal damage to the blockers, then your tramplers get to assign all of their trample damage straight to the opponent's face. It has some really neat tricks in terms of how you can mess with attacks and blocks this way. Also, you get to choose how the opponent's creatures divide their combat damage, right? If you have a big attacking band, you've got like a 1/1 creature that's in the attacking band. If you get blocked, by a Titan of Industry, some giant creature, you can have all of the Titan of Industry's damage be dealt to that 1/1. Right? So all of the creature's damage is assigned to your 1/1. That 1/1 dies. All the other creatures in your band still attack through just fine. This is especially useful if you have a creature with protection from a color that's part of the band. And as we'll see, protection from colors are definitely going to be a thing with this set. So the sky's the limit here. Now, banding can be even more advantageous when you're blocking. Right, if you just have a single creature with banding that blocks an opponent's creature, you choose how that opponent's creature divides its combat damage, not the attacker, right? So you get to choose what order the blockers are assigned in, where the damage is assigned. So suddenly what looked like maybe a pretty good attack for the opponent means they're trading with your worst creature when you have a banding creature on defense. That's going to be a theme that we see recurring in Homelands, is abilities that are better on defense than offense. The limited format is incredibly defensive. I'll go over that later. But yeah, so banding is an ability that can help to break a stalemate. It's also an ability which is excellent at creating a board stalemate. It's a fantastic defensive ability and a totally serviceable attack offensive ability as well. All right, next up we have World Enchantments. They used to be called Enchant World on the card. World is a super type. So if you haven't seen the World super type before, it only appeared on Enchantments. Theoretically, it could have appeared on other permanents as well. And what it basically means is there can be only one, like Highlander. So like you can see in the rulings down here, right? When a world permanent enters the battlefield, any world permanents that were already there are put in their owner's graveyards as a state-based effect, known as the world rule. So, the newest one stays on the battlefield, but it says if two world permanents enter at the same time, they're both put in their owner's graveyards. So be careful if you have an effect that puts multiple things onto the battlefield at once. The world permanents might see each other and all cancel out, go to the graveyard. This is neat because you can use your world enchantment to blow up your opponent's world enchantment, since there can only be one at a time on the battlefield. So it sort of acts like a piece of enchantment removal while also giving you this neat permanent advantage that sticks around. It's a flavorful old mechanic. It's going to be seeing plenty of play here on Arena. All right, so another ability to go over is Regeneration. If you have not encountered Regeneration before, it's kind of like a one-time use of indestructibility. So here, for example, is Dredge Spell, and Dredge Spell can make 1/1 skeletons that have pay 1 black regenerate this creature. So what does Regeneration do? So when you activate this, it puts a Regeneration shield on the creature, which protects them against a future destroy effect or lethal damage. So if the creature would be destroyed, instead you tap the creature, you remove all damage from it, and you remove it from combat. So at that point, it's no longer attacking or blocking once it has regenerated. A creature can have multiple regeneration shields on it, so each one resolves independently. And that's most of what you really need to know about regeneration. It's just, makes a creature stick around. It's hard to deal with. It's a good defensive ability. So once again, there's a lot of good defensive abilities in this set, which will lead to clogging up the board with a multitude of creatures that are all hard to destroy or deal with in some way. Regeneration just plays into that theme some more. Alright, so coin flipping. I believe Winter Sky is the only coin flipping card that exists in Homelands. It used to be that you would see about one coin flipping card about every block expansion, like it maybe in every expansion, maybe every 3 expansions or so. In recent times, Wizards hasn't been making as many coin flip cards, but they used to be kind of a fundamental staple of one-off rares that you'd see every once in a while. So this is Winter Sky. Right, so you'll flip a coin, you'll call heads or tails. If you win the flip, it deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. So this is sort of the symmetrical version, right, of the card that everyone's been running in red recently. If you lose the flip, each player draws a card. So a lot of coin flip cards are kind of like this. They give you something even on the fail state of the card, which isn't necessarily what you wanted, but it's still better than nothing. There were some old coin flip cards that were all or nothing, though. Anyway, the client will do most of the heavy lifting for you. You'll probably just have a prompt that asks for heads or tails. It'll be pretty easy. Alright, so Shroud. I believe Autumn Willow is the only card in Homelands that has Shroud. This used to be not a common ability, but an ability that would, pop up maybe about as often as coin flipping did. It means that it cannot be the target of spells or abilities. That includes you, the controller. Now, Autumn Willow, in this case, was sort of the first version of Hexproof, where you can pay a green, and if you can target a player, then that player can target Autumn Willow as though she didn't have Shroud. So this lets you get around her Shroud as her controller. Otherwise, if a creature has Shroud, it means it cannot be targeted by spells or abilities at all, including by its controller. It's a pretty straightforward ability. Again, it's a good defensive ability. Has no offensive applications. Yet another way to help reduce interaction and stall the game. Alright, Clockwork Creatures. So, I don't think Homelands was the first set that had Clockwork Creatures. There were some older cards like Clockwork Beast and such that I think came before Homelands. I could be wrong about that, but there are two Clockwork Creatures in Homelands. They're both very strong in the limited format, so you should be aware of their existence. They're good picks to take to keep your colors open early on in a draft. And in both cases, they enter with 4 +1/+0 counters. And then at end of combat, if it attacked or blocked, you remove a counter from it. Then you can pay X and tap it to wind it back up. It can never be wound up to greater than 4. So you can only ever wind up Clockwork Steed back to its original power. You cannot pile up additional counters on it. Now with Proliferate, and this is an interesting set with Proliferate because there are a bunch of different counter types floating around. Proliferate would allow you to get above the original 4 power with the Clockwork Creatures. I think it would work just fine. They would wind down as normal after attacking or blocking. So it's kind of a neat interaction. And aside from that, these representing 4 3s when they first come down that wind down to 3 3s and then 2 3s, they're actually some of the better creatures in the limited format. So it's important that you understand how they work. And they're pretty straightforward to use. You can only wind them up on your upkeep. All right, speaking of counters, there are a number of different types of counters to be aware of in Homelands, and since it's going to become legal and standard on MTG Arena, it's important to understand how all of these different counters can interact with your Proliferate cards. So this is Trade Caravan. Right, this is a 1/1 for 1. It is a human. And at the beginning of your upkeep, it gains a currency counter every turn. You can remove 2 currency counters to untap a basic land. You can only use that ability during an opponent's upkeep. Now you need to get a little bit creative with how you untap your mana using this card. It's obviously good with flash and instant speed things like the Wandering Emperor. In the limited format, white is actually an ability. White has a lot of activated abilities. In this format, it's extremely mana hungry. So many of its creatures have some sort of activated ability to increase toughness or prevent damage. And Trade Caravan can be very useful to untap some of your mana on a critical turn. You just have to figure out ahead of time on the opponent's upkeep whether or not you're going to need access to the mana that turn or not. So there's a neat tension built into the card where you're not sure if you're going to need the mana or not that turn. So it's a big choice about whether or not you want to untap things on your opponent's upkeep. A lot of older cards are like this, where they force you into an interesting decision with incomplete information. All right, Coral Reef. Here is another card that adds a different type of counter that exists in the format. And actually, this one card has 2 different types of counters that it cares about. So it's an enchantment for 2 blue. It comes down with 4 polyp counters on it, and you can sacrifice islands to add 2 polyp counters to it, or you could proliferate, and that's probably easier than sacrificing an island. You can pay a blue, tap an untapped blue creature you control, and remove a polyp counter and put a +0/+1 counter on target creature. Now this one is pretty neat because you can do it at instant speed in both cases. It doesn't force you to do it on the upkeep or something. So this can be used as a combat trick, which is very nice. So you can, tap down your untapped blue creatures and start pumping toughness permanently on the board. And you get double duty out of proliferating because you can not just add polyp counters, but then you can increase the toughness of the creatures that have these counters on them. So any card like this where you can get twice as much value out of a proliferate effect is worth keeping an eye on. All right, so -1/-1 counters are a thing in this format. There's 1 or 2 cards, might just be Vampire Bats that adds +1 counters. And Wizards made it to where -1 counters and +1 counters cancel each other out, right? So if a creature had +1 counters on it, and then Giant Oyster targeted it while it was tapped and keeps it tapped down and starts adding -1 counters to it. First, it'll cancel out the +1 counters. And then it will start adding -1 counters after all the +1 counters are gone. These are the only counters, I believe, that work like this. All the other counters in the game, all are tracked separately and independently, which will be very neat for this Homelands format as it enters Standard, because we get to keep track of +1 +0, +0 +1, -0 -2. We're going to see a lot of different unique counters that can all be proliferated independently and separately and tracked separately. So it's going to be great to see how they code all of that on the client. It's an exciting time. But -1 counters are a little bit of a sub-theme in this set. There's more than one card that produces them, so it's important to be aware of how it interacts with +1 counters. Also, while we're here looking at Giant Oyster, this is one of the strongest cards in the set. All right, this is a powerful uncommon. It's easily one of the ways that blue shuts down the game and wins. Right, just pack your deck more than 40 cards and mill the opponent out with your Giant Oysters. All right, the legendary Baron Singier. This is one of the iconic pieces of art from old Magic. We're going to get to play with the original Baron Singier on MTG Arena. It's going to be fun times, exciting, especially since we have black-red vampires from Innistrad in the format. So Baron Singier, when he damages a creature and that creature dies, he gets a +2/+2 counter. This is different than a +1/+1 counter. It is specifically a +2/+2 counter. So if you proliferate this counter, it's going to make him larger twice as fast as a +1 counter would have. He can also tap to regenerate another target vampire, even though he was errated to become a vampire noble. They kept the functionality of his ability to not be able to regenerate himself. If you're in the limited environment, the only other vampire in the set is Irene Singier, the dwarf. She is a vampire, so Baron Singier could regenerate her. But in Standard at large, there are a wide variety of vampires that Baron Singier can regenerate. So the vampires finally have the tribal lord they've been looking for. Is going to be amazing to see this card in play. All right, Greater Werewolf. And I've got to say, this art, the texture and the teeth on this art disturbs me more than most of the art in Phyrexia All Will Be One. There's something about the texture of this art that really bothers me. So this is a werewolf, right? So if you're making a werewolf deck with some black in it, this could benefit. And creatures that blocked or were blocked by, like blocking or blocked by the Greater Werewolf, get a -0, -2 counter. So it specifically reduces their toughness by 2. And this would be an amazing counter to proliferate. Right, creatures that get this -2 power counter, proliferated just once, they've got -4 toughness. And that is an incredible setback. Probably, if you proliferate this counter, most creatures are just going to die. So, seems like it could be a lot of fun. Orcish Mine. So this card comes in with 3 ore counters. Now, you, as the controller of this, do not want to proliferate these ore counters, because when the last ore counter is removed from Orcish Mine, you destroy the enchanted land and it deals 2 damage to that land's controller. So it's not the fastest piece of land destruction, but it's so much cheaper than something like, say, Fall of Krug, or Goblin Firebomb, whatever it's called, the artifact for 7. Well, 7 to activate. Orcish Mine is a clean 3 mana, right? So if your opponent uses the land on their turn, right, then that removes an Or counter from it. Then an Or counter is removed on your upkeep. Then if they use the land one more time, that's when they're going to sacrifice it. So they potentially get 2 more uses of their land, and if they don't tap it for mana, then they get even less use out of it than that, right? If they're not using it for mana, then it's almost like it's already been destroyed. Now, your opponent could proliferate against you in this case, right? They could add Or counters to the Orcish Mine if they happen to be proliferating and keep their land around longer. So that's an interesting bit of play that we have with proliferate in the format. Finally, that brings us to Serrated Arrows. And I think that runs through all of the special types of counters that we're going to see in this format. So this is an artifact that comes in with 3 arrowhead counters. If at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are no arrowhead counters on this, you sacrifice it. And at instant speed, you can just tap, remove an arrowhead counter from this, and put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. Now this one does double duty from the standpoint of proliferate, right? If you can proliferate while this card is out, you can build up additional -1 counters on your opponent's creatures to kill them and weaken them. You can also add arrowhead counters to the Serrated Arrows so it can keep on doing its thing more and more turns in a row. There was a time when this was a powerful card in Constructed, and even though I would say that time would normally have been past, with the addition of proliferating and the fact that it doesn't take additional mana to tap and use this ability, it can be done at instant speed, I think you might see some adoption of Serrated Arrows in Standard. I think decks that are proliferating are going to want this card. It's going to be a good piece of removal that just builds up over time and keeps taking down all of the opponent's things. Alright, this is one of the most exciting changes that's going to happen on Arena. I'm saving the best for last. There's one bigger announcement than this one, but they are bringing back all of the cards, including Temerian Fiends, and that means that they have added playing for ante to MTG Arena, and the implications of this are enormous. People are going to be able to change ownership of cards when they play for ante, and it's just speculation at this point, but people are thinking now that they're going to open up the ability to trade cards on Arena the same way that they do on Magic Online, where you can actually exchange cards with other players. Wizards has been playing this close to the chest so far. They've just announced ante at this point. They haven't announced all the other changes, but if you're able to trade ownership of cards in your collection, then it stands to reason that it's not that much more of a coding issue to be able to exchange cards, maybe even wild cards. Maybe players will be able to trade wild cards, cards in their collection, trade for maybe different art styles and things. So this is an incredibly exciting announcement. But there's one change that's even bigger than this. So Memory Lapse was originally printed as an interrupt. This refers to the pre-6th edition rules of Magic, back when things like interrupts existed and artifacts would be called things like mono artifacts and poly artifacts to designate whether they tapped or not, that sort of thing. With the addition of Memory Lapse, Wizards has announced that they are going to support a format known as PreModern, and PreModern is going to play using pre-6th edition rules. So instead of using the stack, we're going to go back to the batch, baby. It's back to batch rules. So there's going to be interrupts, there are going to be mana burn, right? Blocking creatures that are tapped are not going to deal combat damage. This is incredibly exciting. So the pre-modern format should be incredibly skill testing because the rules do not work in an intuitive way. Pre-6th edition, it's just kind of a hodgepodge of things that were cobbled together. So having a clear understanding of the pre-6th edition rules is going to be an incredibly skill-intensive format, and a lot of spikes out there, like nuts and bolts spikes, who always want to try to make the best play and understand the rules better than their opponent. It's going to be an amazing format in that regard, and people are going to be incredibly surprised how things resolve in batches rather than with the stack. All right, last in, first out still exists, but all of the things in a batch after they've been committed onto the batch all resolve in order and can't be interrupted once the batch has been stacked up. So, for example, that means if a blue mage casts Impulse, they don't get to see the card off of that Impulse, right? They add it to the batch, then it can be responded to, and if they don't, everything in the batch resolves. So that doesn't mean that they get to find a counterspell and then counter something else on the batch. All the things in the batch have to resolve in order first. And then once that batch is empty, then a new batch can start. Players are also going to be pretty surprised by mana burn. Oh, also, if you cast a giant growth on a creature and then the opponent tries to lightning bolt it, all of the damage that occurs in a batch, all of that stuff happens at the end of the batch process, which means that your giant growth creature would actually survive their lightning bolt, even though they responded with the lightning bolt. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be exciting. So many people are going to be taken off guard by the pre-6th edition rules in this new format. It's going to be fun. All right, folks, that is my initial rules primer, what I know so far from Wizards' announcements about Homelands Remastered. This is going to be an exciting time. I have so many more updates about how this is going to affect the metagame in Standard, some new tech that's coming out. So this is just the first video of many, but if I've brought you some value or entertainment today on April 1st, then like, subscribe. You can hit the notification bell, help me out. And until next time, stay cool.